morning. I hope you had a good week and you're enjoying your Friday. Perhaps grab a cup of coffee real quick and let's have a look at that world-famous center of the automotive industry, Canada. Well, you're right, it isn't world-famous. It isn't the center of the automotive industry. But believe it or not, Canada did have a role to play in automaking in North America. So let's have a look, shall we? Gordon McGregor had a strong baritone voice that made him a popular singer at parties and a convincing speaker when he talked business. One day in 1904, he was talking to his two business partners, who were also his brothers. They were in the offices of Walkerville Wagon Works in Walkerville, Ontario, which is now part of Windsor. There are men in Detroit, like Henry Ford, who say every farmer will soon be using an automobile, McGregor intoned, with all the self-assuredness of an older brother. I don't see why we can't build autos right here. His brothers were ready to listen, partly because it sounded like a good idea, but also because they knew their company was in dire straits. Their father had died the year before, and the wagon works he had founded and passed on to them was on the verge of bankruptcy. It seemed doubtful that their business of making horse-drawn wagons was ever going to be as profitable as it used to be, what with these new horseless carriages exciting the public imagination. Bold action was called for. If they failed, the worst that could happen was that they would go out of business, and they were already on the verge of that. The brothers looked at each other, shrugged, and decided that, yes, Gordon should get in touch with his acquaintance across the Detroit River. Maybe that Henry Ford fellow would want some sort of partnership that could benefit both companies. After all, what were automobiles but wagons without horses? Soon after, Gordon made an appointment with Henry Ford, but just to hedge his bets, he also scheduled another meeting with the auto magnate Henry Leyland about the possibility of making Canadian Cadillacs. It wasn't that Ford was doing that much better than the McGregor brothers. In fact, none of the American car makers were doing terribly well. There were too many of them, for one thing. They were all chasing too few customers. There weren't many people who could afford to buy a luxury item like an automobile. Thus far, the Ford Motor Company had manufactured two models of cars, and neither had been successful. But McGregor believed in Ford's vision to build a moderately priced, reliable car for the common man. If Ford could pull it off, it would be a refreshing contrast to the high-priced autos of the day. At the meeting with Gordon McGregor, Ford made it clear that he had long wanted to tap into the mostly untapped Canadian car market. He immediately saw the benefits of having a factory in Canada. For one, he could circumvent Canada's stiff import tariffs, which was 35% on manufactured goods. Best of all, being in Canada as a Canadian business would give Ford access to a much broader and juicier plum, the entire British Commonwealth. And it didn't hurt that hooking up with a willing Canadian partner meant that the development costs could come out of someone else's pockets. Ford could reap much of the profit, while letting McGregor worry about raising the capital to make it happen. The two struck a deal. The American Ford Motor Company would own 51% of McGregor's newly created Ford Motor Company of Canada. In return, McGregor would have the right to manufacture cars using Ford's designs, patents, and parts. Ford Canada would get the exclusive right to sell Fords in almost all of the British Empire, Canada, India, Australia, etc. But there was one big exception. Henry Ford kept the United Kingdom for himself. McGregor was excited enough to agree to those terms. He needed to raise $125,000 for startup costs and immediately began looking for investors. He rounded up enough brave men to get the business going. Although they eventually got many times the return on their investment, for the next few years it looked as if breaking even would be doubtful. In October of 1904, McGregor drove the first Ford Canada car out of the factory and down Windsor's Sandwich Street, Automobiles were still something of a novelty then, with their clouds of smoke, hoarse-spooking noise, and dangerously inexperienced drivers, and this made them largely unpopular, especially in a region that hadn't yet been acclimated to them. Perhaps that was the reason that Ford Canada had trouble at first. By the summer of 1905, the 17 Wagon Works employees had hand-assembled and the company had sold 107 Ford Model Cs and 7 Model Bs. Not the 400 that McGregor hoped would be sold by then. The next year was worse, 101 cars. McGregor was nervous, and his Vesters even more so. They became more heartened in 1908 when things started turning around. Demand tripled. Overseas sales finally started getting a foothold, and at the end of the year the company showed a profit of $19,000. The investors, with their modest dividends in hand, quieted. McGregor offered to buy out any that had cold feet about the venture, but none took him up on the offer. Smart move, because pretty soon they were going to be rewarded many times over. In 1909, Henry Ford unveiled the Model T. This was it, the car that would change everything and would get the middle class and farmers into automobiles. It's hard to over-exaggerate the Model T's impact. Instead of building luxury cars by hand, one by one, Ford was offering a bare-bones design in any color you want, as long as it's black, built by the hundreds on an ever-moving assembly line. Despite this, his no-frills car was sturdy, dependable, and half the price of other cars. Starting at $850 Canadian, about $19,000 in today's money. People didn't know it at the time, but with increased efficiency and economies of scale, Ford would reduce the price each year down to $300 by 1920, and offer payment plans so almost anyone could buy a car, even if it took them years to pay it off. The Model T became a necessity in rural areas. Not only did it make traveling easier, but from Ford, farmers could buy plans and parts to turn the car into a tractor. They could also use the car's engine to power shredders, flour grinders, butter churns, pumps, and anything else normally powered by a horse, by hand, or by a strong back. In 1909, Ford Canada sold 1,200 Model Ts. By 1915, that had grown to 18,700. Both Ford and McGregor became extraordinarily rich, and Windsor became the automotive capital of Canada, as General Motors and Chrysler followed Ford across the Detroit River. For whatever reason, even if it were just to assert some independence from the mother company, Ford Canada's vision of the American-designed Fords usually ended up being a little bit different. For example, the first Model Ts in the United States had an open-air design without car doors. Passengers just stepped over the side panel and into the car. Ford Canada, on the other hand, provided actual doors right from the start. A few years later, when the American model became more enclosed, Ford America offered 2 doors, both on the passenger side. Henry Ford resisted putting a door on the driver's side because he feared the danger of a driver stepping into traffic. Ford Canada did away with that nonsense by offering a 4-door design with 2 doors on each side, justifying it to the Home Office by pointing out that at that time in Canada, some provinces drove on the left and some on the right, and it wouldn't be worth the added expense of making 2 different body styles. The names were different too. A 1923 Model T was called the Roadster south of the 49th parallel, but it was a runabout north of it. Both countries called the 2-door sedan a Tudor, but the Canadians played a sly joke by coming out with a 4-door version called a 4-door. The tradition continued on into the 1960s. Canadian models like the Monarch, Frontenac, Victoria, and Mercury, 2 years before Ford America released a different car with the same name, provided different brands and models from the American lines. Over the ensuing decades, independent Canadian companies like Grey Dort and the Canadian Cycle and Motor Company in the early years, and Bricklin later on, tried to compete with the American-based Canadian giants, but all eventually failed. Then, when the Great Depression hit in 1929, the Canadian companies suffered along with their American counterparts. Canadian car production plummeted from a high of more than 200,000 a year, nearly half of them exported to other markets, to a paltry 60,000, less than 10,000 of which were exported. Canadian car factories shrunk to minimal operations with skeleton crews. They wouldn't become fully active again for a decade, and they had no idea that when their factories did get busy again, it wouldn't be making cars. In 1939, Canada joined Great Britain in declaring war against Germany and its allies. Suddenly, the car companies got an order they couldn't refuse: produce Canadian military pattern vehicles, military trucks that were to be made to British Army specifications. Under pressure and down to bare-bones staffing, Ford and General Motors pooled their engineers and designers. Working together, they created an ugly but rugged design with a blunt snout and a windshield that slanted downwards to reduce glare for both the driver and reflecting glare to enemy fighter planes overhead. Their plants also combined efforts and produced more than 400,000 of the sturdy beasts that were put to good use by Commonwealth troops during and after the war. After the war, the Canadian auto industry returned to civilian production, experiencing prolonged growth as new cars, replaced every 2 years, became part of the new suburban existence. Between 1946 and 1954, Canadian production increased from 92,000 to 375,000 cars a year. Employees increased from 22,000 to 29,000. Cars for export began rolling into ships in huge numbers, aided by the fact that post-war England, Italy, and Germany were in no condition to produce their own cars. Ford Canada opened a huge new headquarters and plant in Oakville, Ontario. General Motors became the country's largest employer. But it couldn't last. By the mid-1960s, Canadian car makers were struggling again with flagging exports, outdated factories, and a small, mostly saturated domestic market. In 1965, Canada's Prime Minister, Lester Pearson, negotiated an agreement with American President Lyndon Johnson that eliminated tariffs and eventually merged the two countries' auto industries into one. This sparked a wave of investment by American firms in Canadian plants, increasing production, employment, and the number of models available to Canadian consumers. But it also marked the end of the Canadian car industry as a distinct entity. By the 1970s, even these consolidated car companies were suffering. An oil embargo and a tsunami of imports challenged North American car companies. Decades later, they're still having trouble. The economic recession caused the country's car makers to request government help in 2008 and 2009. But somewhere among Canada's businessmen and industry folk, there's an entrepreneur like Gordon McGregor keeping an eye out for the next big thing. So there you have it, a little bit of history on the Canadian automotive industry. So hope you enjoyed that. And now I suppose you want a groaner. Well, there's a fellow looking to get himself a pet, and he decided after doing some research that dogs were too much work, cats were too independent, and he wanted something he could interact with. And so after some heavy-duty thinking and looking into it, he decided he'd get a parrot. So he went down to the local pet store and talked to the owner and said he's looking for a parrot. And the owner said, well, I've got 3 great birds right now. I says, right back here, right back here. Takes him to the back of the shop, and here's 3 beautiful parrots on a perch. And the guy says, oh, wow, they're nice-looking birds. Can they talk? Oh, yeah, each one can talk. Yeah, they're all have their own vocabularies. Oh, okay. Well, how much is that one on the end? He's $500. $500? Well, how come? Well, he's a smart bird. He knows how to operate a computer, and he picks up new programs pretty fast. Oh, well, that's pretty amazing. So, well, how about the middle one? How about the guy in the middle there? How much is he? Well, he's $1,000. $1,000? What? Why is he so much more than the other one? Well, besides being able to do all the same things the first pair can do, he can also write programming. Yeah. And he can set up a network for you too if you want. So yeah, he's got more training and better educated than the first pair. That's why he's $1,000. Oh, okay. Well, how about this guy over here on the other end? Well, he's $2,000. What? $2,000? What can he do? Well, said the pet store owner, nothing as far as I know. I've never seen him do anything. But the other two birds call him boss. There you go. Hope you've enjoyed today's little bit of history of the Canadian automotive industry, and wish you all a fantastic weekend. Enjoy yourselves. Have a great time. Until Tuesday with Tuesdays with the Pilgrim, take care, stay safe, and God bless.